Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our Greek reading group through the Gospel of Luke. And last time we ended the Magnificat with Mary singing praise to God and giving him thanks, for his mercies and singing his praises. And a question that Dwayne asked last time, which I didn't get to, then we talked about it afterwards, is it appropriate to compare this with Hannah's song in 1 Samuel? And I believe that is chapter 2. And the answer is yes, very appropriate. Very common themes. You have a woman giving birth, and Hannah's song has a lot of very similar themes. And Luke is evoking Israel's past in these opening chapters, and the expectancy of salvation is very high. The Lord working with his people. And so at one point when I was lecturing through Luke, I developed charts showing the permeation of Old Testament ways, established ways of knowing God and God interacting with his people. And Luke chapters 1 and 2 are just permeated with backwards referencing to things that would say that God is working in a very concentrated way in these events which are transpiring and evoking past ways that God has said he was going to work with Israel. So you have covenants mentioned, not just in Mary's song, but in these chapters. So you have covenants mentioned, you have the patriarchs mentioned, you've got sacrificial systems which are acknowledged and practices. You have Davidic themes, messianic kinds of themes. You have prophesying taking place. You have angelic visitors. You have people being filled with the Spirit. And so, yes, you have lots of things happening here. And one of the things are these hymns of praise to God in response to his saving activities. So yes, would be very appropriate and has been done to compare Mary's praise to God with Hannah's song, given the thematic, not only the situational parallels, but also the thematic content parallels. Yes. Okay, so we're going to pick up at verse 56. Iminende Miriam sun avte os meneanas tris ke up es strepsen iston ikon avtes. All right, we have a de, and that de signals next step or next development. And we're moving out of the song into then some action. So the praise, the Magnificat ends, and then Mary, we get some details about Mary's remaining. And this is a liquid verb, meno, which has compensatory lengthening when the sigma is rejected. This is aorist active indicative, third singular. Miriam is subject. Sun avtes, avte is referring back to Elizabeth. And then we have about 3 months. Os indicating the approximate time. 3 months, tris menas. And then she returned into her house, into her home. So Mary stayed with Elizabeth and then returned back home. Verse 57. So let's go ahead and I think I can turn on the drawing there. Drawing mode, we'll actually do some marking. Another development, de. Te de Elisabeth epleiste o chronos tu tekin avtein ke eyenesten wion. For Elizabeth, or something like that. Dad marks new development. For Elizabeth, this is a dative, probably of reference, with reference to Elizabeth, or I mean, you could see it as maybe a dative of advantage, but basically it's referencing us back to Elizabeth. And then you have the time of her birthing. The time of her birthing was fulfilled. This is from Pimplemi. You got an augment there, a place, they, aorist, passive, third singular. And you have an interesting construction with chronos. So chronos is the subject, it's nominative. It's followed by a genitive. But then we see an interesting construction with an infinitive. Basically, we have an articular infinitive that's really used as a noun. Infinitives are verbal nouns by definition. Participles are verbal adjectives. Infinitives are verbal nouns. And here we see this verb of birthing as an infinitive. And it is from tic-toe. So we have a second aorist formation there. So it's an aorist active infinitive, tech. And then the subject of the infinitive, or technically, I think is an accusative of reference, she of her birthing. So the time of her birthing. The infinitive is functioning as a verbal noun. And then whenever you have an infinitive construction, well, most of the times, there are a few exceptions when the subject is the same as the main verb. Typically, the subject of the infinitive is placed into the accusative case. And that's what we have here, the time of her giving birth. So, in addition to that, added to it, ke eyenesten, we have genao, the verb yenao. It's a simple aorist. This is a contract verb with an alpha contract that lengthens to an eta, aorist third singular, and she gave birth to a son. Yeah, it's a pretty simple sentence with an interesting construction with an infinitive. Okay, question. Question here is, rather than modifying chronos, could the genitive article just be helping to make the infinitive construction express purpose? Yeah, purpose of fulfilled time. Yeah, so the time was fulfilled in order for her to give birth. That would make sense. That would make sense. And maybe that is even the better way to take it. I'll have to look into that. What that would mean then is we'd mark it up a little bit differently. Let's see, let me turn that drawing mode back on. There we go. So what that we'd mark that as an infinitive clause. So the time was fulfilled in order for her to give birth. Yeah, I'd have to look at the difference of that. What, how we could tell the difference with that kind of construction. Yeah, whether it's a genitive time of. I think the proximity for me would suggest more what I was saying, but I just need to check whether that's grammatically feasible. The infinitives are treated like neuter nouns. So they take the neuter article. You can't tell here that this is neuter, but it is in the genitive. And in infinitives of purpose, you can have particular. I think they can take the genitive. I think more commonly though, they're just nominative or accusative. Again, I'd have to look that up. Look that up there. Yeah, good question. All right, verse 58. Ke ekusan I periki ke I sun ines avtes oti mega lunen kurios to elios avtu meta avtes ke sun ekaron avte. All right, and the neighbors heard, and her relatives. So both these parties are subjects. That. They heard that. And what do they hear? They heard that. This is the content of their hearing. The Lord magnified his mercy. To eleos is neuter accusative. Remember that neuter nouns have the same form always. And particular neuter noun will always have the nominative and accusative forms will always be the same with her. So the Lord displayed his great mercy with her. Now notice what they did is mercy is not modified by great, but they're getting the idea of greatness from the verb. So rather than saying he magnified his mercy with her, they changed the verb. They downplayed the verb to simply display, but the verb means to magnify. And remember that Mary is magnifying the Lord, so that's how she begins her praise of Lord in the previous passage that we read. So yeah, it's interesting that the translational choice there. I think it's important, to his great mercy. Great would make mercy, it'd be an adjective to mercy as kind of a quality of his mercy. But the verb is stressing the quality of his action. And there's a difference there. Abstract noun with an adjective versus a verbal action that is being stressed, magnified his mercy. So I think something is lost there. I think something is lost with her. So these people heard this, and I guess this is imperfect tense. So it's there's no sigma there, an augment. So the Lord was magnifying his mercy with her. So it's interesting to use the imperfect tense there. And I guess the mercy would be, the magnification is an ongoing event, ongoing description. I think because not only was she pregnant, which was incredible, not only did she give birth, but she's going to have a son. So this mercy continues on in the life of this child. So I think the imperfective aspect is interesting to consider. What does that entail? And they rejoiced with her. They were rejoicing with her. So soon, kero, to have joy with, and this often verbs with a soon is a preposition added on to the front. They take the dative case as the direct object. I'm going to double underline that because functionally avte is the direct object of this verb. All right, so neighbors and relatives are rejoicing repeatedly, continuously with her. Ke, and. And the reason that all the kes were highlighted was because I had selected a word here and there's a setting, I think, or actually I was hovering over a ke, and when you hover over a word in Logos, you can activate finding words that are cognates of that. I have that setting set up. So, all right. So I'm going to turn that off as I'm marking. Let's just try marking the text. Verse 59, ke yeneto ente emerate ogdoe elthon peretemin to pedion ke ekalun avto epito onamati tu patros avtu Zacharias. All right. And it happened. All right. So what we see here is that after this initial de, which marks a distinctive moment, and that's the second de, that we saw a de in verse 56. So after Mary finishes singing, a de, and then verse 57, a de. And then after we get going with Elizabeth, we've been seeing kes connecting things. And here we have another kes. So these kes are signaling kind of a continuity of scene. So we're kind of in this Elizabeth scene. It's framed with Elizabeth, with reference to Elizabeth. And then we're having these kes. And then we have this construction that we see in Luke, which is a transitional device. But here we see that it's a light transitional device because it's also connected with a ke, and it's associated with a time frame. So there's a switch in time frame, and it happened on the 8th day. So in with the dative of time, specifying time at which. And so here it's significant because it's right on the 8th day. This is when Jewish boys were circumcised. So you have an attributive position, ente emerate ogdoe. Egdoe is a second attributive position, stressing the 8thness of the day. And it might seem odd for this day time to be stressed. You know, why? Because the second attributive position is when you have the article noun, article adjective. The alternative way could have been to not have an article, but simply to put the adjective 8th between the article and the noun. And in fact, that's what we have here as a textual variant. So you can see the ogdoe emera at the top. So look at verse 59. You can see that that is a textual variant where they did away with that extra article. So the question that I have is then why would the 8thness of the day be stressed at this point? And I would say that this contributes to a theme of lawful behavior of people in the presentation of Luke 1 and 2. We're going to see that also with regard to Mary and Joseph and how they treat Jesus and what they do with him. So there's attention paid to law observance. And this is when the child was supposed to be circumcised. And Luke is stressing faithfulness here by this. It's a real slight little thing. And in fact, it threw some scribes off because they're like, well, why are we emphasizing 8th? And they actually changed the word order, dropped the article to make it more, or to make it less stressed, to make it a simpler construction. And so that's a significant scribal change. And so the question is why would the original text stress that by use of the second attributive position, which is more stressed by repetition of the article? And the answer I would posit is the lawfulness of the action. All right, so Then let's continue our marking. So it happened that on the 8th day they came. Now this verb is a transitional device, and the almost, it's like the content of the what happened is given in the in what follows. Now often what follows is a finite verb, but we've also seen instances where there might be an infinitive construction. And what I like to do, I think is to put the elthone. I'm going to go ahead and put that as almost like a subordinate clause, because I want to affirm the function of the egeneto. It is strictly is not needed here. It could have simply, we could have dropped that, right? This would have made perfectly good sense. And on the 8th day, they went to circumcise the child. Okay, so the egeneto is really functioning. I can't really easily undo that unless I exit it. This is really functioning to set this off in as an important occurrence, as a significant occurrence. And so, in fact, they went to circumcise the child. So they came to circumcise. Now here, this is a type of purpose construction. It's a mild type. There's different ways to form purpose constructions. In fact, my paper proposal was accepted at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting in Denver, and I'll be talking about the 10 different ways of purpose constructions that I've identified. And then we'll be looking at some examples of that. This is a mild type. It's with a verb of motion, moving right into an infinitive. Come to do something. Jesus came to fulfill. So there's other examples of this kind of construction. If you wanted to really ramp up the purposive action, you could use another construction. You could use, ina with the subjunctive. You could have used isto with the infinitive, or prosto, and so I'm going to be looking at these constructions in my paper. Probably be a chapter in a book that I'm writing, and in terms of when are they used, and what's the different marking grammatically, what's being construed with one construction as opposed to the other. All right, so they came to circumcise the child, and they were calling him by the name of its father, that is the baby, the paidion, him. They were calling his name Zacharias. Now, this is a double accusative construction. So kaleo, you can call someone something. So they were calling the young boy child, calling it neuter to match with paidion, Zacharias. So Zacharian, this is a double accusative. One's internal, one's external. The external is what you start with. You have this baby. And then when you go through the process of calling the baby something, that something is produced in the action of the verb. That's called the internal object. So the external object here is the baby, starts outside the action, goes through the action of calling, and they want to call the baby Zacharias. Now, they presumably are the priests or the people around when they're circumcising the baby. And one other thing to just note here is that peritem temin. I was going to say that's a there's a little bit of a stem change there because of it's again a liquid verb, peritemno, and then the nu drops off with the sigma, and so you have a slight stem change indicating that it's aorist tense. Okay, so double accusative, they were calling him, and the imperfective aspect is interesting because it suggests maybe the opening up a scene. That can be one use of the imperfective, is that something is starting to be happening, and so they were calling him this, but it's not the end of the story. So to get to the end of the story, we have to keep reading in verse 60. Verse 60. And I think we can move on from there if there's no questions. I'll pull that up, and then I'll turn my marking back on. Okay. And so we are in the same scene, a lot of kes, answering back. This is the verb apokrinome. Apokrinoma and apokrinome is a verb that takes back control of the conversation or the action. It's a pushback, it's a response back. And the intensity of the response can vary from very vigorous to mild. And so it depends on the situation. Here, there's a pushback, responds back. And she's responding back to them wanting to name the child after its father, Zacharias. So answering back. And so Levinson and others say this has a taking control kind of idea, taking control. And that's what's happening. The mother of its mother, the mother of the child, answering back, said. And here we have an uki. So apokrithisa e meter avtu ipen uki Allah kleithesete iuanes. And that's what she said in response. So this is a little circumstantial participle forming a subordinate clause. I'd consider it as providing a framework, that this is a pushback in what she says. And she responds with a strong negative, not just u, but uhi. Uhi is a strengthened form of u, and it's a no. No. So the pushback with the strong no answer, and then you have the Allah. And really you have a little uk Allah construction here, uk Allah, which is a corrective. Allah is a conjunction marking not contrast, but correction. And that's a slight difference. It's a slight difference. So here we have the correction. He will be called, and there's a nice verbal ending, thesete. It's 3 times more than 3 times longer. I guess it's 2 times longer than the verb stem itself. So kaleo, put into the future passive. He will be called John. And this is a nominative of appellation, of naming. So this verb we saw takes 2 accusatives when it's active. You can call someone something, but when you have a passive construction, what you're calling that person remains in the case of the subject. And in this case, it's nominative, which is, there's a few places I could probably take you where the case is different because the subject case is different given the construction. But yeah, this is a nominative called a nominative of naming or of appellation. Ke, verse 60 then, 61, ke ipan pros avtein oti udis estin ek tes sun ianias su os kalite to onamati tuto. And they said to her. Now, not just simply dative case, but pros. So there's a slight elevation of, I think, proximity or intensity. Ipan pros avte. You could have just used the dative case. And instead, they're engaged here. And they said to her, and what did they say to her? Well, the content is found after the OT clause. And so the OT marks the beginning of the direct discourse. So when you don't need the OT here, though. We have examples where discourse begins without an OT. In fact, we just saw it. And we just saw it previously. So OT can be used. And the question is why is OT sometimes used for direct speech quotations? That's called OT recitative OT. And why is OT sometimes missing? Now, Levinson's answer was that recitative OT tends to, when it's used, is used at the end of an exchange. But this is not at the end of an exchange. In fact, the story continues because it's not resolved yet. So I think that OT rather indicates prominence. And so there's a prominence. Prominence can entail at the end of a discourse, like the last word that's said, introduced with an OT direct discourse, OT recitative OT there. But I suspect that it simply is indicating prominence, and that prominence could be medial. It could be in the middle of an exchange. Okay. So yeah, this is I think it's a prominence device. And we see that there's some elevation in their speaking because you have pros with the accusative rather than simply the dative. They said to her, no one is from your relatives who is called by this name. So no one. And so their response is rather prominent. They're saying no one is named this. No one of your relatives. So this is a prepositional phrase, ektes sun enias su. No one from your relatives who, there is no one from your relatives who is called by this name, dative of probably by means of this name, called by means of this name. So this is a relative pronoun clause, os, that is going back to udis, who. No one is, who is called. And this is a present middle passive form, third singular, by this name. No one is called by, or by this name. Okay, so they're a bit puzzled by this. I'm curious about this textual variant. Rather than the dative, they have the nominative form, who's called by this name. The difference, though, why this shouldn't be nominative is because it's, well, no, I guess it could be. Yeah, so there's a little bit of a, why isn't this a nominative in form to go with, this person is called this name. But I think the dative does make sense as a dative of name, like name, with the name of something. So that's an idiom too, with the name of, to onemati is an idiom. Okay, so then in verse 62, we have a new development with the de, and then nenavon de to patriautu, to ti an theli kaliste of to. All right. So here we have them making signs. So this is imperfective aspect. And these people then start making signs to his father. So they make signs to his father. And then the content of the signing, this article is nominalizing what they're signing, what they're wanting of the father, whatever he would want to call the child. Now, this is an indirect question inside of historical sequence of past tenses. And we've seen this before, and Luke tends to really like it with indirect questions to pop into the optative. It's an optative used in an indirect question in historical sequence. The on is functioning here to suggest possibility. So whatever he would want to call the child. So this is thelo, which takes an infinitive, a complementary infinitive. And so we have that infinitive kaliste with its object. So what would you want? So the original question would be, what would you want to call it? What should you call it? What would you like to call it? But then it's put as a indirect question with the toe, which marks it as the content of the signing. So I don't know how they would be signing this. And it's interesting that they're signing it. And we're going to come to that in just a moment. I want to show you something. But, in English, we'd be like, I don't know if they'd be like, question, with like, what are you going to call him? Or something like that. I don't know what they would have signed. But there's some kind of gesturing going on. And the thing that's interesting is, why are they signing it? Because, Zachariah was mute. He wasn't able to speak. But if you go back, he was probably mute and unable to hear, deaf, mute and deaf. So if you go back to his punishment in verse 22, the word there for mute, kophos, actually has in its range of reference, so the inability to speak, and that's often how it's translated, he remained mute. But if we look at its meaning, it also has to do with deaf, being deaf. And often these went together. Someone who was deaf was not able to speak. And so I think that was a cultural assumption. Someone's not able to speak, so therefore they're not able to hear, they're deaf. And so the people there are signing at Joseph. They're giving signs, somehow conveying, what do you want to call this child? They must be pointing to it, question mark. Maybe they're saying speech. What do you want to call it? And so I find that very interesting, this exchange, trying to figure out what to call the child. And ke etesas penakkidion igrapsen legon. And we're starting to see some very interesting participle uses. These participles are Randall Booth, in a paper on the Greek verb revisited, has a chapter there, essay on participles that I would recommend to you to read. He talks about them being efficient information packages, and I heartily agree with that. I think there's more to be said, but
I do appreciate what he wrote there. And so asking, so what is he seeking? And I guess I shouldn't have ended the bracket where I did. So you got a subordinate clause here. He's asking for this, a penakirion. A penakirion is a tablet, and it's got a diminutive ending on it. Whenever you see eon, it's a diminutive form. We saw that with pes earlier, pedion, and now we're seeing it with a little tablet. So asking for a little tablet, he wrote, saying. So what kind of participle do we have here? It's pre-nuclear. That is, it's fronted before its nuclear verb. The nuclear verb is the verb of the clause that it's in. So egropsin is aorist third singular. Egropsin's got the augment. The grapho, the phi, becomes a psi when the sigma of the aorist is added to it. So this is pre-nuclear. And in my understanding of information structure of participles, present this in my Koine Greek grammar, the furthest away use of a fronted participle is circumstantial, is that it's providing a segue. I don't think this is providing a segue. I think then the next closest, and this tends to be in proximity, would be framework. So segue verbs, segue participles have to do with transitions. I don't see this as a transitional. Verbs of motion and with location, that kind of stuff. I don't see this as transitional. The next one could be framework. Is this providing an important framework? But I also started noticing that some participles are directly abutted to the main verb that were describing a procedure, like something that is prerequisite to the action of the main verb. These are often classified as attendant circumstance, but I think we could call them maybe procedural. And I think this may be a procedural participle. Seemingly, this is really not technically needed, although it's presupposed with the idea of writing. He'd have to have something to write on. So this is prerequisite or procedural kind of action that I found often is unnecessary or preserves some cultural logic or cultural information. And here I would say this provides important cultural information because it explains on what he is writing, a little tablet. So in either case, this happens. He asked for this somehow, and he must have just gestured. He must have, pointed or whatever, and then he wrote it down. Now, this other participle is really interesting. Legon. This is not strictly needed. In fact, you can see the omission there in the textual tradition. That little O there marks that this is there's a textual variant where this is omitted. This I might consider a redundant use of the participle because it strictly is not needed, and it repeats information of the participle. So this is one of the uses of post-nuclear, post-positioned after the verb of the clause, the main verb of the clause. And so I would consider this a redundant use. Now, redundant participles usually have said, sang, or did, doing. Like I found examples of did, doing, and thinking even. So this redundant verb of redundancy, often we think of it in terms of verbs of saying, but it does occur to other types of actions. But here it's with writing as a form of saying. The function of these redundant participles is to emphasize, to bring prominence to what follows. And here we're getting the prominence, and that is, his name is John. So here's the direct discourse of writing. This is the content of the writing saying, John is his name. Yeah. And it's interesting, there's no article there. John is his name. Now, what's significant about that, I'm guessing that's what's put in there, is an article. And I have to look at this. Yeah, to. What's interesting is you probably would expect an article, because they've been talking about naming and everything. The name is what's being stressed, but the lack of the article stresses that. Onoma. It is indeed stressed. That's been the focus. But scribes are like, no, we want to put an article there. And you can see that there's, some pretty important witnesses there that have the article. But probably there was no article to stress name, because that's what this passage has been about, the name of John. And then we have a response, and all were amazed. That's simply all that means. And all were amazed. So they're amazed. What are they amazed at? So that's the question. What are they amazed at? Are they amazed that they changed the name, that he was so quick to respond and write out a name that wasn't common? Well, if we look at the textual variant here, there's a couple, and they begin to switch around what happened. They begin putting this first, and then they were amazed. So verse 64 is that his mouth was opened immediately, and his tongue. So these things were open, therefore they were amazed. Then they were amazed. So the scribes are struggling with the order here. And I think the question is why are they amazed? Are they amazed that he has a distinctive name that's not in the family? Or are they amazed because he's speaking, like literally his mouth and tongue are loosed? So the scribes here are wondering what order things happened. That's what they're wondering about. So verse 64 is ane okthein de thede to stoma avtu parakrema ke eglosa avtu ke elali evlogon ton tion. And I'm going to go back into marking mode because there's some interesting things here. So we get a de. Now, de here marks a distinctive addition. And I think here a translation might be moreover, or additionally. And what is added to the story is that his mouth immediately, I'm circling that. And here we have a ke that connects his tongue to his mouth. That's a compound subject. Both of those are subjects of the verb enok the, which is third singular. So the tongue being kind of added on. So even though the verb is third singular, this is from anoigo. It's a pretty wonky stem change there because of the gamma changing to a key before the theta, and then it just starts to look weird, and then there's an augment thrown into the mix that makes that verb form really kind of tricky. So that's the aorist passive third singular indicative. So his mouth was opened immediately, and his tongue. And so it's third singular, even though it seems like it has a plural subjects, but it may be that the tongue is kind of added on as something in the mouth, profiling his mouth being opened and his tongue. And then we get action of his tongue because he lali, he was speaking, and he was speaking. And then we have a post-nuclear participle clause. And this one is not, well, it could have been, we could see it as redundant, a redundant use. The other post-nuclear use of a circumstantial participle is called explanatory. And this one, I think, could be understood as explanatory. And he was speaking. And what's the content of his speaking? He was blessing God. He was blessing God. Yep. So this is either redundant again or explanatory. He was speaking, imperfective aspect. Oh, I bet he was speaking. It was repeated action. Yeah, repeated action. All right, verse 65, and it happened. What happened? Upon all. Well, fear, phobos, ke egeneto epi pantas phobos, tus peri kuntas avtus. So fear came upon all. Now this is really interesting because it's separated. Phobos is actually the subject of egeneto. Egeneto, fear came. And then it's actually separating the adjective and the noun that the adjective is qualifying. All the neighbors of theirs, all inhabiting, all residing near them. That's what, or around them. Peri ikuntas is a substantive participle with this tus, which means neighbor, those living nearby them. And avtus is the direct object of this participle. So yeah, this is a separated, discontinuous constituents, but rather than being separated by the verb, which is commonly what we see, adjective on one side of the verb, then the noun, here we have the subject separating the adjective and the that which is modified by that. That's interesting, very interesting. So I don't know if it stresses the fear is in the midst of them or reverence. What kind of fear is this? Is this I think it's probably a sense of awe of what's happening. But yeah, so we could possibly see this as appositional. So the ones, so we could put and if I'm not sure about something, I put a little question mark. This could be appositional. So fear came upon all, comma, that is the ones dwelling near them. That's possible. It seems a little bit odd. So, but the discontinuous separation with the subject is a bit odd too. And in all the hill country of Judea, all these things, all these matters, and I know this is subject because this verb is from dialaleo. This is a third singular form, third singular and middle passive form. So all these things is the subject of this third singular verb, which is middle passive. We're being talked about. Dia, when it's added to a verb, can sometimes have a distributive kind of sense, like spoken through. So all these matters, and rema, we think of it as meaning word, but it can mean matter, like a thing, something. So all these matters were spoken about in all the hill country of Judea, the whole.
what we're seeing, what you should know about these adjectives like pas and olos is that they're not put into the attributive position, even though they have an attributive translation in English. So they stand outside of the attributive position. We would have normally have seen an adjective squeeze between here. And the same thing happens with panta. We would have normally seen ta panta and then remata, but we don't. And here we see it again, all the ones hearing. So these adjectives of quantity don't like being put strictly into the attributive position. And so but we translate them as if they are in that attributive position. Okay. And one more verse, because I want to get a good stop right there. And I know some of you might need to go. And all the ones hearing set. They set. This is from tithemi. The ti, the tav iota at the front is dropped, and it only persists actually the ti in this verb, and this false reduplication only persists in the present tense. So if you're looking at a me verb like tithemi, didomi, that false reduplication only is present in the present tense. And so if you see it without that, you're looking at another tense. And here, present and imperfect tense, it's retained. So if you don't see it, you're looking at an aorist or some other tense form. So here, this is aorist, third plural. All the ones hearing set in their heart. They set in their heart, saying. And here we have a post-nuclear participle. And what are they setting in their heart, saying? So all the ones hearing set in their hearts, saying. And so this is, or saying in their hearts, or set in their hearts. I don't know. But so these matters are being spread about, and so people are wondering, and they're setting in their heart and wondering, saying, what then will this child be? That's what they're wondering about. What will this little child be? Because all these miraculous events were taking place around his name. For also, the hand of the Lord was with him. For also the hand of the Lord was with him. So I don't know if this is a reference to the activities after his birth, or just the activities around his birth and his naming. So I think the quotation ends here, and then you have the narrative comment, and you can see over here what they're doing with that. For also the hand of the Lord was with them. So John the Baptist is going to be something big because of all this activity. Well, we're going to end it there, and we'll pick up in verse 67 next time. So look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.